Welcome back to So You Really Want to Learn Latin, and today we are going to be looking at primary and historic tenses. And we're going to be looking at these because we need to understand the difference between primary and historic to pretty well finish off our work on indirect statement. There's a little bit more to do, but this is an important step in really mastering indirect statement. And so we just need to understand, what do I mean when I say that some verbs are primary and others are historic? The primary tenses are present, future, perfect, and future perfect. And the imperative also counts as one. Okay, those are primary tenses. Historic tenses are imperfect, pluperfect, and the simple past. Do you remember that tense that we translate into English as I loved? Rather than I was loving or I have loved, just I loved. That simple past tense is a historic tense. Okay, so some tenses are primary, some are historic. Well, so what? Okay, well, we're just going to do a little bit of English grammar first, and then we'll see what happens when we go into Latin. The examples we've given so far of indirect statement have all been introduced by a verb. I don't know if you've noticed this, but a verb in the present tense. They all began he says, or he knows, or he believes, or he perceives, or he says. Okay, all of that stuff. They were always introduced by that present tense. And the present tense is a primary tense. They could have been introduced by a verb in the future. They could have been, he will say. So, for example, he will say that the Gauls are attacking the town. Or they could have been introduced by a perfect tense. He has said that the Gauls are attacking the town. Okay? So, indirect statement introduced by a verb that is in a primary tense work the way we have discussed up until this point. Okay? You introduce it with a verb in a primary tense, and then you have an accusative and infinitive. But if the verb introducing the indirect statement was a historic tense, so something like he said that, what you find is the tense in the indirect statement has to change, because otherwise it sounds wrong. Okay, so we can say he says that the enemy are fighting, but if we change that to he said that, what actually happens in English is are fighting changes to were fighting. So he said that the enemy were fighting. Okay? Now, what he actually said, if you'd put inverted commas around what he actually said, he said, the enemy are fighting. But if someone then says, what is he saying? You've got two choices. You can either say, he says that the enemy are fighting, or you might say, he said that the enemy were fighting. Okay? You wouldn't correctly say, he said that the enemy are fighting. I know, it doesn't sound badly wrong, but it actually is wrong. Okay? Now, you probably will hear people say, he said that the toast is burning. Well, actually, when he said, the toast is burning, and someone said, what did he say? And someone else might say, he said that the toast Probably you will hear people say, he said that the toast is burning. But that, strictly speaking, isn't correct. It should be, when reported indirectly like that, he said that the toast was burning. Okay? Trust me on that. It's just, it's a rule that in English you probably follow without thinking about it. But, in Latin it is important. So let's just, let's just stick to English grammar being as sort of tight as we can keep it, because the Latin grammar is very strict. He says that the enemy will fight would change to he said that the enemy would fight. He says that the enemy have fought will change to he said that the enemy had fought. Okay, so if the verb introducing the indirect statement is a normal primary tense, present, future perfect perhaps, then everything stays as we've done it. He says that the enemy are fighting, he says that the enemy will fight, he says that the enemy have fought. But if the verb introducing the indirect statement is in a historic tense, and that's most likely going to be this simple past, he said that, then when you translate it into English, you're going to have to change it to he said that the enemy were fighting, he said that the enemy would fight, and he said that the enemy had fought. Okay? Okay, so let's just have a little look at that in Latin. So, the difficulty with the simple past in Latin is that you sometimes don't know whether it is a simple past or a true perfect. So, for example, if you have Dxit, it's not always obvious whether that means he has said or simply he said. Okay? But for the purposes of this, I'm going to give you some examples where I'm telling you that the verb introducing the indirect statement is a historic tense. It is a simple past. Okay? Okay, so we'll use Dxit where Dxit means he said. Right? So if you had Dxit Agricolas in agris laborare, okay, Dxit, he said, Agricolas, that the farmers, in agris, in the fields, and then laborare, that is our infinitive of our accusative and infinitive construction. So he said that the farmers, laborare, were working in agris, in the fields. Okay? So that present infinitive, laborare, is being translated not as are working, but as were working. And that is because the verb introducing the indirect statement was a historic tense. He said. Okay? Okay, so if you had Dxit nautas tabernas amare, and Dxit is historic, he said, right? Dxit nautas, he said that the sailors, tabernas amare, loved inns. He said that the sailors loved inns. Okay, so another one, let's say, Dxit hostes castra prope flumen possuisse. Okay, Dxit, he said, hostes, that the enemy. Now, what have they done? What are they doing? What's going on? The infinitive, possuisse. He said that the enemy had placed castra, their camp, prope flumen, near the river. Okay? So, he said that the enemy had placed, possuisse, perfect infinitive, active, of pono, translated as had placed. He said that the enemy had placed. Okay? If the verb introducing that indirect statement was a primary tense, like Dxit, he says, then it would have been he says that the enemy have placed their camp near the river. But it's he said that the enemy. So has placed has to change to had placed. Okay? Okay, and then we'll do one with a future. So we've got one here in the book. Crede barmus, barbaros oppidum mox opungnaturos esse. Okay, crede barmus. Right, now that's clearly a historic tense because the imperfect is always historic. So we believed, barbaros, that the barbarians, go to the infinitive, opungnaturos esse. Now that's a future infinitive. So you're kind of thinking it's will, but no, because it's after a historic verb introducing this indirect statement, we believed, it's going to change from will to would. We believed that the barbarians, opungnaturos esse, would attack Oppidum, the town. And if you've got mox in there, soon. We believed that the barbarians would soon attack the town. Okay, so kind of translating them out of Latin into English isn't really very hard, but it does sort of rely on your accepting this point about the English language, that when you've got a primary tense, like he says, then it's fine to say things like he says that he is, or he says that he will, or he says that he has. But if the verb introducing the indirect statement is a historic one, like he said, then it's going to change to he said that he was, he said that he would, and he said that he had. Okay? You know, you're just going to have to trust me on that. Now, when you're going the other way, this, in a sense, becomes more important even, if that's possible, because you're going to be finding English sentences to translate into Latin that use things that you think you don't know how to say, like would, for example. So, if you want to say, he said that the enemy were coming, he said that the enemy were coming, we know it's going to be an indirect statement. We know that that uses the accusative and infinitive. Okay? But the were coming bit, you know it's got to be an infinitive, but you're thinking, were, which infinitive? I only know three. I know the present infinitive, the future infinitive, and the perfect infinitive. Well, were coming sort of sounds to me as if I need an imperfect infinitive, and there isn't such a thing. So how do you cope? Well, there's a lovely little rule on this. And to get the right infinitive when you're translating an indirect statement into Latin, you go back to what you think the original statement actually was, when it was a direct statement. In other words, if it's somebody saying something, what did they actually say? Okay? So, if you have the sentence, he said that the enemy were fighting, what did he actually say? Well, what he actually said was, the enemy are fighting. Okay, in the present. When you report it indirectly after a historic verb, he said, you're going to say he said that the enemy were fighting. So you say he said, Dxit, that the enemy, hostes, and then the infinitive is the infinitive that lines up with the tense of what he originally said, which was, the enemy are fighting, present tense. So you need the present infinitive. Dxit hostes pungnare. He said that the enemy were fighting. Okay, now if you had he said that the enemy would fight, again, what did he actually say? Well, what he actually said was, the enemy will fight. So he said that the enemy would fight. Dxit, he said. That the enemy, hostes. And then for would fight, go back to what the original words were. The enemy will fight. That's the future tense. So you want the future infinitive. Pungna turos esse. Future infinitive active. To be about to fight. And finally, if you had, he said that the enemy had fought. You know, there is no pluperfect infinitive, so how do you cope with had fought? Well, he said that the enemy had fought. What did he actually say? He said, the enemy have fought. Okay, perfect infinitive. So, Dxit hostes pungnavisse. He said the enemy to have fought. He said that the enemy had fought. Okay, now there's quite a lot to get your head around there. But actually, the main thing you're getting your head around is not Latin, it's English. Okay, this concept of primary and historic tenses applies in English just as much as it applies in Latin. And getting this sort of, it's actually called the sequence of tenses, and we'll talk about it later. But lining up he says with he has, and he said with he had, is a feature of the English language. Latin, in a sense, didn't have the problem because only having a present infinitive or a future infinitive or a perfect infinitive, it kind of had to choose which one to use, and it lines up the most appropriate one with the statement. Okay, so when we go on to longer passages of Latin, and I have told you, indirect statement is absolutely central to the Latin language. It's used the whole time. You'll find that you recognise accusative and infinitive constructions. You know, there they are. But often the difficulty is to translate them correctly into English. You know kind of roughly what it's saying, but sometimes your translation will be hampered by getting your English a bit wrong, not the Latin. Okay? I think that'll become clear when we move on to do these passages, and I'll point them out as we go along. But, you know, that's enough for now. Primary tenses, present, future, perfect, and future perfect. And by perfect, by the way, I mean the perfect tense with the word have or has. I have done it. He has done it. We have done it. That proper perfect tense. Those are primary. Historic tenses, imperfect, simple past, and pluperfect. And simple past, remember in Latin, can either be translated using the imperfect tense, bam, bar, spat, or the endings of the perfect tense, the e, ist, it ones. But as you now know, and we have mentioned it before, the simple past in Latin has kind of two ways of being translated, either using the imperfect or using the perfect. But either way, it's a historic tense. Okay? And you're going to really need to get this distinction in your mind pretty clear between primary and historic, because there's something coming up over the horizon which you really need to know it. Okay? So just, you know, have a think when you're looking at English or when you're listening to somebody talking, just see if you can spot the difference between primary tenses and historic tenses. And in particular, how they're used together in the same sentence. He says that the toast is burning. What did he say? He said that the toast was burning. Okay? Nothing's actually changed with the situation regarding the toast. Or indeed what it was he said when he said it. But it's just the way you report it indirectly, which of course is what an indirect statement is. Okay? Right, I'll see you next time to do something on reflexive pronouns, and just a little tiny bit more on indirect statement, and then we can head off into the future with some things called final clauses. Okay, so hold on to your hats for final clauses. But until then, keep up the good work. Do subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you back here on this channel very soon.